Welcome back to Killer Stories. I'm your host, Bobby Holmes. First of all, I apologize for the delay of this episode. I thought I was recording earlier today, and it's a lengthy one. And then I stopped it, and apparently I'd never hit record. So here I am, second attempt. We're gonna try this again, see how it goes. Today's case was suggested via email by listener David Lilly. He wanted me to cover convicted serial killer John Bunting. His string of murders is known as the Snowtown murders, or the bodies in barrels murders. To give a quick overview, John Bunting takes it upon himself to rid Australia of pedophiles and homosexuals. I hate even linking those two things together in a sentence because pedophiles are scum of the earth, but apparently John felt just as strongly about the gay community. He doesn't really separate the two. To him, gay people are pedophiles. Just to be clear, I understand the difference. In no way am I saying they are even remotely similar. Bunting has 11 known victims and is dubbed Australia's worst serial killer. But there is much more to this case. Bunting was the ringleader of a gang, we'll call it, who worked together to kill. Some of them became victims themselves. The gang took it a step further by collecting the victims' bank information and their government funding after their deaths. So they get their thrills and make a profit. The 2011 film Snowtown is based on these events. I personally have not braved myself to watch. My friends and fellow podcasters, Lorraine Purdon and Stuart Blues, were supposed to cover it on Once Upon a Nightmare, but couldn't make it through. So you know it must be bad. I did, however, watch Snowtown, Bodies in the Barrels, a crime investigation Australia documentary, which was the main source for today's episode. There are a lot of people involved in this case, and I will do my best to not overcomplicate things. But this may be a good one to watch on YouTube, as I will have photos to go along with the story. John Justin Bunting was born September 4th, 1966 in Queensland, Australia. As a child, Bunting would put insects into vats of chemicals and watch them die. I'm not sure that this falls into the category of cruelty to animals because I would say most of us have killed an insect, but he enjoyed watching them suffer. I imagine the tunes from Who Framed Roger Rabbit melting in The Dip. Great movie, by the way. Bunting reports being sexually assaulted by a friend's older brother growing up, but this was never confirmed. He didn't tell anyone at the time, and the accused died in a motorcycle accident not long after. Perhaps this is what triggered his hatred for pedophiles. In his early 20s, Bunting moved into a house on Waterloo Corner Road in Adelaide. He met and quickly married a young woman named Veronica, and Bunting befriended a neighbor, Robert Wagner. Wagner was 18 years old. I'm going to assume a school dropout because he is described as being illiterate. Wagner lived with his boyfriend, Barry Lane. Lane was quite a bit older than Wagner, 16 years his senior. He often cross-dressed, during which he liked to be called Vanessa. Lane was more than a cross-dressing gay man. He was a convicted child predator. And he started grooming Robert Wagner when he was just 13 years old. Bunting spent a lot of time with his new neighbors, along with another man, Mark Hayden. And this part is very confusing to me. How can Wagner and Lane stand behind Bunting and his beliefs when they themselves are homosexuals? And how does Bunting not see the irony in this? One theory is that Bunting didn't believe Wagner was truly gay. He was groomed by Lane and could be saved. In the meantime, Bunting could gain insight from a real pedophile, Barry Lane. My theory is Bunting is in the closet, and he is trying so hard to deny his true self that he is willing to go as far as murdering gay people to prove he isn't. I don't know, just a thought. I mean, it's weird to be like, I hate gay people, yet surround yourself with them every day. It just doesn't make sense. This group of men, as different as they may or may not be, did have something in common. They were all white supremacists. They sat around and listened to Bunting spew his hate. They viewed him as their leader and followed his plan of action. The first victim was Clinton Treziz. Clinton spent most of his childhood being passed around different foster homes. In August of 1992, Clinton had just gotten his first apartment in Adelaide. As a young adult, this is an exciting time in your life, a step towards independence. Clinton made friends with the locals. Unfortunately for him, that happened to be Wagner and Lane, and their friendship was just a ruse. Clinton dressed in flamboyant clothes, wearing things like bright red and purple pants. Because of this, Bunting referred to him as Happy Pants. Apparently, wearing brightly colored clothing was reason enough to die. Clinton was invited into Bunting's home. Once he was inside, Bunting snuck up from behind and bludgeoned his head with a shovel, hitting him repeatedly, crushing his skull from all angles. Bunting called Wagner and Lane for help. They drove far out of town and buried Clinton Treziz in a shallow grave. Even though he assisted with the aftermath, Barry Lane was shocked that Bunting murdered someone. Lane shared this information with Bunting's wife, Veronica. It was really meant as a warning, so she knew the kind of man he really was. But the decision to talk would come back to haunt him. After a few weeks without contact, Clinton's sister attempts to file a missing persons report. And I guess the claim was not taken seriously because records show a report was not formally filed until 3 years later by Clinton's mother. I assume the family wasn't very close. 3 years is quite a long time to wait before filing something like a missing persons report. What do they say? Like the first 48 hours are the most dire in these cases? We are way past that. And as you can imagine, the case goes cold. His body went undiscovered for 2 years, and it took 5 more to get a positive ID. Bunting's marriage to Veronica was on the rocks. He got himself a new mistress, Elizabeth Harvey. She had 2 boys that lived with her from previous marriages, Troy Eude and James Vlasakis, who went by Jamie. Jamie didn't have the greatest upbringing and shared with Bunting that his birth father and an ex-boyfriend of his mother's both sexually abused him. After this, Jamie showered obsessively. He would scrub his skin so hard he would make himself bleed. Later, his older brother Troy followed in those footsteps and molested 13-year-old Jamie. This caused Jamie to become a heavy drug and alcohol user at a very young age. Bunting told Jamie that Troy deserved to be taken out for what he did. Jamie would eventually fall under the spell of John Bunting as well. Suzanne Allen, a friend and neighbor of Bunting's, gave a tip about a man she believed to be a child predator. 26-year-old Ray Davies was actually Suzanne's ex-fiancé. After the breakup, she allowed him to continue living in a caravan behind her house. He was known around the neighborhood as a peeping Tom. He hid in the bushes and masturbated when young girls walked by. Suzanne was under the impression he assaulted her nephews, but I do not have confirmation that was true. Davies was mentally challenged and an easy target for Bunting and Wagner. They abducted him and took turns beating him with clubs. They placed him in the bathtub at Bunting's home and tortured him. Bunting's girlfriend, Elizabeth Harvey, assisted in the torturing of Davies. She truly believed he was a pedophile, and Bunting convinced her that he was deserving. He was ultimately strangled to death using jumper cables. Ray Davies' body was buried haphazardly in the backyard. He was never reported missing to police. I don't know what it is about John Bunting, but people were attracted to him like bees to honey. Suzanne Allen and Bunting were having an affair, the mistress to his mistress. When he called things off, she went a little crazy. writing daily love letters and driving up and down the street of his home to try to catch a glimpse of him. But that came to an abrupt halt. Bunting found Suzanne lying dead in her home, presumably from a heart attack. But instead of calling the police like a normal person, he dismembered her body and buried her in the backyard. Why? So he could continue to cash her Social Security checks. When dismembering her body, Wagner held her head up to Bunting with the sounds, trying to make him kiss her. The whole thing was just a big joke to them. Suzanne was reported missing by her family. When police arrived, they found that her pets were in the home and had been neglected. Her family suspected foul play because Suzanne loved her pets and would never abandon them. Nothing surfaces regarding Suzanne's whereabouts, and her case is left open as a missing person. After Suzanne's death, Bunting, his girlfriend Elizabeth, and her 2 sons moved from his home in Waterloo Corner Road to the town of Murray Bridge. Wagner and Lane had split, and Wagner was now engaged to a woman, so either Bunting did his due diligence and saved him from being gay, or he's bisexual. 19-year-old Michael Gardner was the next victim. He rented a room from his landlord, a woman named Nicole Zarita. She was more like a friend than a landlord. In the documentary, she said that Michael would wear wigs and ask to be called Michelle. They would hang out and paint each other's fingernails. The connection here is weird, and try to follow me. Nicole, who is Michael's landlord, had a cousin named Vicky, and Vicky was having an affair with Robert Wagner. So because Michael is friends with his landlord, the landlord hangs out with her cousin, who brings around Wagner. Michael Gardner is brought up to the gang as a person of interest. Bunting and Wagner abduct Michael and take him to the shed in the backyard of Bunting's new house in Murray Bridge. They tied Gardner up and tortured him for hours. Gardner died by strangulation and is forced to look into Bunting's eyes as he takes his last breath. Up until this point, the victims had been buried. Bunting had a new plan for disposing of bodies. The gang dismembered Gardner and sealed him inside of a barrel filled with acid. Hence the name Bodies in the Barrels Murders. The barrels were stored in the shed behind his house. He and his men attempt to gather Michael Gardner's ID and financial information. They can't find his wallet in his room and decide to ransack the whole house. His wallet was actually in Nicole's house, but the men weren't successful in their search. Nicole shared with Vicky that she hasn't seen Michael lately, but found his wallet in her house. And of course, word gets back to Wagner. Desperate to get his wallet, Bunting calls Nicole pretending to be a friend of Michael's. He said Michael really needed his ID and would she meet him at the park with it. Could he be any more sketchy? Hi, my friend here. Yeah, he can't talk right now. He needs his wallet. Come meet me, a stranger, at the park and just go ahead and hand over that information. That'd be great. Luckily, Nicole is smarter than that. But the calls just keep coming. Every day a new threatening phone call. She does eventually give in and hand over Michael's wallet to Jamie Vlasakis, who is posing as being Michael's friend. Wagner was Bunting's true partner in crime. He never really liked Lane, and now that he wasn't dating Wagner, Lane was fair game. He had a new man, 18-year-old Thomas Trevillian, and he was a troubled young man suffering from mental illness. He wore nothing but camo and was obsessed with the military. It's as if he had PTSD from the military, but he never served. He reportedly ran outside bearing a knife anytime he heard a noise in the night. But it didn't take much convincing from Bunting for Thomas Trevillian to turn on Barry Lane, naming him as a child molester. I mean, he is a 42-year-old man, and Trevillian is just a teenager. Trevillian joined Bunting and Wagner in the capture and torture of Lane. To cover their tracks, they forced Lane to leave a message on his mother's answering machine, saying that he was moving to Queensland. Then the men used a pair of pliers to crush each one of his toes. After strangling Barry Lane to death, they wrapped his body in a rug. Like the other victims, Bunting and his men collected any funds to Lane's name. A few days later, they returned to dismember Lane and placed him in a barrel of acid to join Michael Gardner in Bunting's shed. A woman who was friends with Barry Lane reported him missing, and apparently he told her about the murder of Clinton Trezise. And now that I'm looking at it, it might be Trezise. I probably said that wrong all the way through so far. She also shared that information with police, but they're like, oh, well, Barry told his mom he was moving to Queensland, so I bet that's where he is. End of search. Trevillian couldn't keep the details of Barry Lane's murder to himself. When Bunting found out he was running his mouth, he gathered his gang and abducted him. They took him into the woods and made him stand on a box with a noose around his neck. With his mental issues, they thought it would be easy to make his death look like a suicide. For those keeping count, that is 5 murder victims for Bunting and his gang, not counting Suzanne Allen, who died of natural causes. Bunting had a new group of people to add to his hit list: junkies. In 1998, Jamie Vlasakis was still living in Bunting's home with his mother. A friend of his, Gavin Porter, had recently moved in as well. Jamie and Gavin were both heroin addicts. Bunting may not have cared about their drug use at first, but he became enraged when he accidentally pricked himself on a used needle. Gavin Porter had carelessly left it lying on the couch. One day, while Jamie was out of the house, Bunting and his men attacked Porter while he was sleeping in the back of a car. He received the typical beating, torture, and strangulation that the other men endured. Gavin Porter was dragged into the garage and placed into a mechanic's hole in the floor. They covered him with couch cushions and ordered Chinese food as if nothing happened. When Jamie did come home, Bunting took him into the garage and showed him Porter lying dead on the floor. Jamie was shocked and terrified. Then Bunting took Jamie to the shed, lifted the lids of the barrels to reveal more dead bodies. The stench of decay filled Jamie's nose and he fell violently ill, but it didn't bother Bunting one bit. He lost his sense of smell as a kid from an illness, similar to the symptoms of COVID-19, but for Bunting, it was permanent. The only thing he felt was pleasure seeing the progress of disintegration. Moving forward, Jamie goes along with whatever Bunting says, because he doesn't want to end up in a barrel. The main thing he needed from Jamie was to obtain Gavin Porter's financial information. And as I'm sure you guessed, he was then dismembered and put into a barrel. To bring Jamie fully up to speed with the rest of the gang, Bunting wanted him to experience a kill. He wanted to take out Troy Yude, Jamie's 21-year-old half-brother, the one who molested him when he was 13. Troy was sleeping in his bed when Bunting, Wagner, and Jamie sneak up on him with various weapons. They beat Troy and drag him into the bathtub. Bunting walked Jamie through what to do, cheering him on. This time, the torture and murdered was captured on audio tape. He forced Troy to apologize to Jamie before strangling him to death. Jamie drained Troy's bank account, using his cut of the profit to buy drugs. As you can imagine, 4 bodies in acid-filled barrels, the tiny shed was beginning to smell a bit ripe. Well, to everyone but Bunting. From the shed, they were moved to Mark Hayden's garage. Not even a month after Troy's murder, they killed again. But Bunting has fallen far from his guidelines of pedophiles and homosexuals. The next victim is chosen because it would be too easy. You can tell it's now just purely for the enjoyment of killing. I'm not sure what it is about Bunting that women find so irresistible, but a woman named Jodi Elliott was in love with him. So says Murderpedia. The podcast Serial Killer says the woman's name is Gail Sinclair. Maybe one or the other source is protecting her true identity, but I'm going to refer to her as Jodi. Jody was the sister of Mark Hayden's wife, Elizabeth, and lived in their home as well. I'm sorry, I told you this story is so confusing. Jody had an 18-year-old son named Fred Brooks who was mentally challenged, and this made him an easy target that Bunting just couldn't pass up. The torture on Fred Brooks was extremely brutal. Cigarette butts were put out on his skin. The red-hot lighter was used to burn a smiley face on his forehead. An electrical device was used to shock his genitals. And perhaps the most cringeworthy thing I have ever heard, they stuck a sparkler into his penis and lit the end, watching it burn all the way down. Bunting used a syringe to inject water into his testicles. The fact that Bunting hates pedophiles so bad, yet he abducts an innocent 18-year-old boy and does this to him, I just can't make sense of it. Most of the victims died of strangulation, but Fred Brooks passed away from hours of torture he endured. He was then dismembered, added to a barrel, and taken to Hayden's house. Bunting liked this easy target thing, especially when there was a disability pension he could get his grimy hands on. A 29-year-old man named Gary O'Dwyer fit the bill. He had permanent brain damage and walked with a limp from a hit and run that happened in his early 20s. The gang became friendly with O'Dwyer in an attempt to get close, and then they made their move. He was tortured using similar methods I previously mentioned. He was strangled to death and moved into his own barrel. But not before Bunting collected O'Dwyer's financial information and forced him to leave a voice recording. Like Barry Lane's message left for his mother, the recording would be used to throw others off their trail. The victims were now heading even closer to home. The next person Bunting chose to torture and kill was Mark Hayden's wife, Elizabeth. Why? There didn't seem to be any real rhyme or reason. Bunting just didn't like her. Mark was not around when she was killed, and I'm not sure if he was aware of the plan, but he did help cover it up and dispose of her body. Elizabeth was reported missing by her sister the next day. How are there so many deaths connected to this inner circle and no suspicions been raised? The barrels were in Mark Hayden's garage. Now that his wife became a victim, they needed to be moved. Bunting rented an old bank building from a friend named Peter 2 hours away in Snowtown. They transported the barrels using a trailer attached to the back of a Land Cruiser. They locked them inside what used to be the bank's vault. But the smell of death leaked out from the old abandoned bank, raising eyebrows from the people of Snowtown. Back at the Hayden home, police searched the house, finding Elizabeth's purse, something a woman never leaves home without. They noticed a foul odor in the garage but couldn't find the source. It was just now that police noticed something that couldn't be a coincidence. Bunting's name came up in the missing person cases of Elizabeth Hayden, Clinton Trezise, Barry Lane, and Suzanne Allen. They decided to tail him and see if they could get any more information. They tapped his phone line and listened in on his calls with Wagner. Even though they were on his trail, Bunting killed one last time before he was brought down. The 11th and final victim was David Johnson, a new stepbrother of Jamie Lasakis. David wasn't gay, but Bunting treated him as if he was. His nickname for him was Faggot. Jamie convinced David to ride with him to Snowtown to buy a used PC. When they arrived, David was confused as to why they were walking into an old abandoned bank. Then he was hit with the smell of decaying corpses. Bunting came up from behind him and handcuffed David. They forced him to record audio messages into a computer and then began their torture. David fought back with everything he had, breaking a few of Bunting's ribs. But in the end, he was strangled to death with a belt. Before being placed into a barrel, Bunting cut off some of his flesh and stashed it in a rubber glove. Some sources state that once they returned home, Bunting cooked the flesh in a frying pan and consumed it with Wagner. Police were closing in. Neighbors of Mark Hayden reported seeing the men loading the Land Cruiser with barrels. The Land Cruiser was tracked to Snowtown. Peter noticed the police cars and came outside to talk. He explained that Bunting had used the Land Cruiser to move the barrels into the bank. He had a key and led police inside. They were able to pick the lock to the vault, exposing 6 large plastic barrels. They also found bottles of hydrochloric acid, a saw, a belt, knives, handcuffs, and rubber gloves. The barrels were taken into evidence and examined by Adelaide's forensic scientists. It was confirmed that it contained the remains of 8 human bodies. John Bunting, Robert Wagner, and Mark Hayden were arrested for murder. 19-year-old Jamie Vlasakis was terrified. He confessed his involvement to a friend, including the fact that there were additional bodies buried. Feeling relieved to get it off of his chest, he returned home. But as soon as he did, his friend called the police and ratted him out. Police discovered the buried body of Suzanne Allen and Ray Davies. The body of Clinton Trezise was also linked to Bunting and his men. Jamie Vlasakis was brought in for questioning. Initially thinking he would get immunity for speaking against Bunting, he told them everything. But he was way too involved. Jamie Vlasakis was charged with 4 counts of murder. He was ordered to serve 4 consecutive life sentences. October 14th, 2002, trial began for John Bunting and Robert Wagner. Jurors dropped like flies throughout the trial due to the graphic description of events. They had to start over multiple times, but in the end, Bunting was convicted of 11 counts of murder and Robert Wagner 7 counts of murder. They would both spend the rest of their lives in prison. The judge stated the men were, quote, in the business of killing for pleasure and were incapable of true rehabilitation. Mark Hayden was originally charged with 2 counts of murder and 6 counts of assisting offenders, but his murder charges were eventually dropped, but made that 8 counts of assisting offenders. With 11 murders, this was the most horrific case of serial killings in Australia's history. And I don't know how I've never heard of this case, but I guess I have David Lilly to thank for the suggestion. If you have a story suggestion, please send it into KillerStoriesPodcast@gmail.com. You can follow me on social media. I'm on Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook at Killer Stories Podcast, and on Twitter, I'm at Killer Story Pod. Keep your eyes peeled. I'm going to have new merch available soon. Missy at Freedom Street Boutique is working some tie-dye magic, and I can't wait to share it with you. Thanks so much for listening. Until next time, this has been a Killer Story.